Welcome to our Financial Security for All webinar. We are delighted to have Axton Betz-Hamilton with us today. Our topic today is familial identity theft. Years ago, and some of you will remember, we used to teach in-person classes for bankruptcy filers to fulfill that education requirement, that debtor education requirement that people who filed consumer bankruptcy received some education about money management. And one of the things that always struck me was how many people, especially it seemed like older adults, had ended up filing bankruptcy because they had been victims of some kind of financial abuse by oftentimes a family member, an adult child or adult grandchild, someone who had used their personal financial information, their social security number or their bank account numbers to obtain credit in that person's name, credit that they never repaid or took responsibility for. So we're really pleased to have with us today to talk to us about familial identity theft and about how we as educators can help people identify it and avoid it, and what we can do as educators to help those consumers we serve. Axton has a PhD, and she is also an accredited financial counselor with AFCPE. She's an assistant professor of consumer affairs in South Dakota State University. Her research focuses on financial abuse and within families, specifically this familial identity theft and elder financial abuse, often perpetrated by family members. She's been a victim of identity theft herself, and she's the author of a book that chronicles her personal story. Her book is The Less People Know About Us, A Mystery of Betrayal, Family Secrets, and Stolen Identity. And just so delighted and honored to have Axton with us today. So thank you, Axton. Welcome.
Today, as Laura shared, I'm going to be sharing information with you about familial identity theft, and I'm going to focus on what extension professionals need to know to help victims and their families. As Laura mentioned, I am a victim of identity theft, and I'm actually a victim of familial identity theft, and that experience is detailed in my book, which you see a screenshot of here on this slide. That book chronicles my personal experience with identity theft, as well as how my career in higher education was shaped by my experience as a victim of identity theft. And I didn't know I was a victim of familial identity theft until after I had finished my PhD, after I was an assistant professor. And I won't spoil it for you, but I did find out 20 years after the identity theft began who was responsible for it. So it's quite a story. I wrote it in part as a way to inspire other victims that, yes, you can be successful. Yes, you can overcome this. And yes, you can find who is responsible for the identity theft if you just stick with it and don't give up. As Laura mentioned, my research focus is financial abuse within families. And so when I started my career, when I was in graduate school, I really focused on identity theft. And that was in part due to the frustration I was experiencing as a victim in trying to recover my identity back in the early 2000s. And I completed my master's research project on identity theft because I wanted to help other people understand this problem and how serious it was. And a more selfish reason for pursuing that line of research was that I hoped through the research I was doing that I would be able to identify the person responsible for my identity theft. And of course, my identity theft story began when I was 11, but I didn't know my identity was stolen until I was in college. But I had been told that my parents' identities were stolen when I was 11. Back then, the early 90s, no one knew that child identity theft could even happen. Also, within my research, I focus on financial exploitation of older adults by family members. So I've broadened a little bit from my days in graduate school, just focusing on identity theft. And now I focus more on financial abuse within families across the lifespan. So in this webinar, I will share information about the definitions of familial identity theft as well as its prevalence. I'll also talk about why we don't really have good prevalence statistics on familial identity theft. I'll then discuss the consequences of familial identity theft victimization. We often think about those financial consequences, that's because that's what we can quantify, I think. People wrap their head around numbers a little bit better than those more abstract consequences that are related to emotions and physical well-being, as well as relationship well-being. I'll then talk about characteristics of offenders. Since I learned the individual responsible for my identity theft, I've shifted my focus a little bit further in my identity theft research, and I'm really interested in perpetrators, particularly familial identity theft perpetrators, and what makes them tick, what motivates them, why do they make the choices that they do with regard to perpetrating identity theft. And then I'll conclude with how consumer educators can use this information. So moving into the definition of familial identity theft and the prevalence of familial identity theft. Familial identity theft occurs when an individual obtains and uses the personal identifying information of a family member for personal gain. That personal gain is usually financial in nature. That could be credit, could be government benefits. Personal gain could also be for medical benefits, such as prescription drugs, and so on and so forth. Identity thieves are creative, so there's no exhaustive list that I or anyone else could create with every possible benefit that a identity thief could use someone's information for. Now, familial identity theft can be child identity theft. So some identity theft cases that you encounter can be categorized in multiple ways. Familial identity theft can be child identity theft because parents are the number one perpetrators. So we don't often think of child identity theft when the parent is a perpetrator as familial identity theft, but it is because that parent has stolen the child's identity. Familial identity theft can also fall under the category of financial exploitation of an older adult, and adult children are common perpetrators of this type of exploitation. So we don't have good prevalence data, and I get this question all the time. How many people are victims of familial identity theft? We don't know, in part because of these overlapping categories. If there's a case of identity theft and it's an older adult who's a victim and the adult child is the perpetrator, it's more likely to be categorized as financial exploitation of an older adult, in part because there's more resources available to help victims when it's categorized that way versus familial identity theft. Same with child identity theft. Also, underreporting. So victims of familial identity theft often don't report. And this could be for any number of reasons. Maybe in the case of an older adult, the older adult may have cognitive impairments where they don't know that they've been a victim, or they don't have the capacity to understand that they've been a victim. They may not be physically capable of going to a law enforcement agency and filing a report. They may be physically or emotionally dependent on that family member perpetrator. Same with victims of child identity theft. So with children who have had their identity stolen by a family member, they likely don't know it. So, that's a big reason why these cases aren't reported. I'll use my own case as an example. So my case started when I was 11, but I didn't know I was a victim until I was 19. So there's 8 years there where my identity theft should have been reported, but I didn't know I was a victim of identity theft, so I couldn't report it. Children are also, by definition, dependent on their parents. So they're likely dependent on the perpetrator financially, emotionally, physically. So, and they often don't want to get their parent in trouble, so they'll choose not to report. So ultimately, we don't really know how many victims of familial identity theft are truly out there. So a lot of the research that I do focuses on familial identity theft, and using the National Crime Victimization Survey Identity Theft Supplement, which is a national data set that is collected by the U.S. Department of Justice. In analyzing that data, I discovered that the financial consequences of familial identity theft victimization aren't significantly different from the consequences of identity theft victims who had their identity stolen by a non-relative. So some common consequences, which you're probably well familiar with, are damaged credit, higher APR for any loans obtained, required deposits to establish utility service, and higher auto insurance rates. As you know, your credit score is one variable that's used to determine the rates that your auto insurance company assesses. So that's a consequence that financially that victims often incur. I'm going to share some of the emotional consequences of familial identity theft victimization as shared by participants in my research. And so I have conducted a study on familial identity theft, and all of the participants had their identity stolen by a parent. Now, some of them had their identity stolen while they were under the age of 18. Some had their identity stolen by their parent after they were 18. So those emotional consequences that were most common among these participants were fear, anxiety, and mistrust. And those were all responses that I heard among the many others. So one participant said regarding fear, "I'm more afraid of the IRS than police officers, someone with a huge gun. I'm really afraid of them because I know they don't see me as a person. They have unlimited capacity to ruin my life if they wanted to, even if I haven't done anything wrong." So this participant had her identity stolen by her father, and he used her identity to establish multiple businesses. And because the businesses were established using her identity, the taxes were assessed to the victim. And this started when she was 6 years old. She had no idea this was going on until she was an adult and had her wages garnished. She contacted the IRS and basically said, "Hey, look, I was 6 years old. I can't be held responsible for this." And in her experience, the IRS wanted their money, and they were not sympathetic to her situation. So she had a fear that developed over time of interacting with the IRS. So another participant expressed anxiety, and this participant had her identity stolen by her mother. And she said she was afraid of picking up the phone when it's strange numbers because she doesn't know who's calling and is always afraid something else is going to spring up. And I think this is a common reaction among identity theft victims, not knowing what's next, because it feels like there's always something coming. There's always a surprise bill. There's always a surprise collection agency contact. There's always a surprise court summons. There's always something that springs up, and you may not know what's coming. Personally, I used to be afraid to check my mail. When I was in graduate school and I was still fighting, the good fight to recover my identity, I was getting collection agency letters all the time. And I had this sense of anxiety and dread about going to check my mail because I knew every day, like this participant, that, there could be something in there. And there usually was. Regarding mistrust, one participant said, now when I call banks or I'm talking with financial people, people ask, what's your social security number? I need your social security number. Why? Why do you need that? Use something else. You don't need my social security number. I come off kind of harsh, I guess. So this participant had his identity stolen by his father. His father also stole his brother's identity, who participated in the study. And not only did the participant express mistrust towards other family members and challenges with his own personal relationships, he struggled in interacting with financial professionals when they were asking for information they needed, maybe to establish a new account. He still hesitated with giving that information because it had been used against him to cause harm in the past, and he was afraid by sharing that critical information that it could happen again. So an interesting emotional consequence is younger familial identity theft victims are more likely to experience feeling worried or anxious, angry, and vulnerable as a result of the victimization compared to older identity theft victims. And this is based on analysis that I have done of the identity theft supplement data that's a part of the National Crime Victimization Survey. So when conducting this analysis, I initially analyzed emotional consequences for familial identity theft victims and non-familial identity theft victims. And I found that there were no significant differences. But when you add age, things start to become more significant. So the younger familial identity theft victims are more likely to experience these specific emotions, and that could be for a variety of reasons. It could be that they're in the stage of emerging adulthood. They may not have the life experience that older familial identity theft victims would have regarding managing their emotions. They may not have the same support system as older familial identity theft victims, and so on. But definitely interesting result that I found with that data. And then physical consequences of familial identity theft victimization. So still using the same data. So the identity theft supplement that is a part of the National Crime Victimization Survey. Once again, I explored the physical consequences of familial identity theft victimization by comparing familial and non-familial identity theft victims. So I ran a series of binomial logistic regressions to do this, for those of you who are familiar with that statistical technique. And I only found one statistically significant result when I just compared familial versus non-familial victims, and that's headaches. So familial identity theft victims are more likely to experience headaches as a result of the identity theft victimization than non-familial identity theft victims, which I found really interesting. That's the one statistically significant result when you compare familial versus non-familial victims. So, like with the emotional consequences, I added age to the models. And again, no additional statistically significant results. Oh, well, that's interesting. Well, and I thought, well, let's try income. And that's when the results started to get more significant. So familial identity theft victims who have a higher income are more likely to experience trouble sleeping and high blood pressure as a result of the identity theft victimization than familial identity theft victims who have a lower income. Now, the data in that survey can't tell us why. Why this is the case. It might be because they're concerned with protecting their assets. They have higher incomes. Maybe they're more concerned with protecting their net worth and their assets from further exploitation, and the trouble sleeping and the high blood pressure are linked to the stress of that. We don't really know based on the data we have. But really interesting that the physical consequences of familial identity theft victimization are linked with income, and the emotional consequences are more linked with age. So interesting findings from this data. Regarding the relational consequences of familial identity theft victimization, broken family relationships are really common. So in the study that I conducted on familial identity theft victims' experiences, it was a qualitative study, so I conducted interviews with victims, and I had the goal of interviewing at least one other family member. And I can only do that in one case with the two brothers, because the identity theft had severed family relationships so severely that the victims didn't want to give me the contact information of other family members because, I don't talk to them anymore. This has damaged our family so severely that I can't rely on them. I don't talk to them. I don't want you to talk to them. And that was a very common response when I asked victims to provide contact information of other family members who might be willing to participate in the study. Also, a lot of folks in the chat talked about trust and the inability to trust. And that is a very common relational consequence of identity theft victimization, particularly for family members, because, there's that sense of betrayal, and that inability to trust others can lead to the dissolution of current relationships. And it can also lead to the avoidance of forming relationships out of fear of being harmed by someone that, they might trust in the future. So it's a way of self-protection, but it can be a very misguided attempt at self-protection. So again, using the data from those participants I interviewed for my familial identity theft study, which again, they were all victims who had their identity stolen by a parent. And the most common characteristics of the offenders that resulted from that research included things like lack of guilt and being manipulative of the victim. And lack of guilt is a core feature associated with antisocial personality disorder. And this participant said, I think she felt bad that she got caught, but I don't think she felt guilt. I think she felt like she was getting restitution against a world that had been unfair to her. So again, all of these characteristics that I'm sharing are based on perceptions that the victims had of their parent perpetrators. Lack of guilt is something that I think my perpetrator had, or I guess didn't have, as well. And I say that because if you don't want the book spoiled, don't Google me because there are a lot of news stories about me. But there's a photo out there on the internet of my perpetrator standing next to me at an award ceremony when I received an award for my child identity theft research and outreach shortly before I finished graduate school. So, and there was no guilt on her face. She's smiling from ear to ear. So I think this lack of guilt, not only from the findings of my research, but from my own personal experience, I do think this is something that warrants more exploration in the research literature. And then manipulative of the victim. This participant said it was framed as this is just a normal thing a parent does for their child. So I didn't really question when, like, oh, I went ahead and took care of some paperwork for you. It never occurred to me that she might have been signing things under my identity that she shouldn't have been. So in both of these cases, as you can probably tell, the mother was the perpetrator. And in this particular case, the parent manipulated the victim to think that, oh, mom's signing my name to things. Oh, that's just normal. She's helping me. She's helping me establish myself, as an adult, when she was really stealing her identity. Now, the findings from this part of the study I did are being published next month in the Journal of Financial Counseling and Planning. So if you want more details about this and you're an AFCPE member, you'll be able to have access to that journal article next month. And then another characteristic familial identity theft victims or offenders that resulted from this study was offenders were perceived to be concerned with public image. And so one participant here who had her identity stolen by her father said, my dad has 500 suits in his closet and he had 20 watches. And you know why the twins win their games is because people are focused on their pinstripes, that line from that movie. I'm like, there it is. Because it was all about appearance. We had a corner lot in the neighborhood with a 2-story, very prominent house right across from the pool. As my husband says, it was such an ego move. It was. It was always ego related. So this is a trait that, in my personal experience, as well as my research, that again, I think warrants more consideration in future studies. And that concern with public image is a trait that's commonly associated with narcissism and narcissistic personality disorder. So for those who mentioned that in the chat, I think we're on the right track with that thinking. Other characteristics, one thing that I found from this study is that perpetrators were engaged in multiple forms of abuse or criminal activity. Emotional abuse was the most common co-occurring form of abuse in addition to the identity theft. And there was one case of human trafficking. So in this particular case is incredible. In fact, I should probably do a case study on it. The victim, her father, sold her into human trafficking when she was a young child, and he was somehow involved in the human trafficking as well. He was financially benefiting from it. And this is also the participant who had her father establish fraudulent businesses in her name and had to deal with the IRS. And she was able to break free from that. She was homeless for a while. During high school, she said she lived in the woods during high school, and she successfully completed high school, went on to college, graduated from college, and has her master's degree and is married and is doing quite well. So, her particular story is, I think, a testament to resilience and overcoming. And that's another point I do want to make too. A lot of familial identity theft victims overcome their circumstances through perseverance and I think resilience. I think that's something that we don't think about as much with regard to victims and the resources that they have available to them. We tend to refer, and I'm going to talk about referrals later, but perhaps exploring what internal resources that victim has to recover is just as important as connecting them with community and other resources. So frequent offenders, as I've mentioned before, are parents in cases of child identity theft, spouses. This is really common in the military community. It's also associated with domestic violence. Now, not all cases of spousal perpetrated identity theft are linked to domestic violence, but there is an association there. And adult children, as I've mentioned, are frequent offenders when the victim is an older adult parent. So in my research with these same participants who were victimized by their parents, I asked them to talk about what resources were helpful in their recovery and what resources were not so helpful. And the helpful resources that they mentioned were mental health professionals. In fact, that was the most common. Obtaining their credit report, social workers, youth program staff, in-laws, attorneys, and religion or spirituality. Unhelpful resources were federal agencies, creditors, and immediate family. Now, when you look at these lists, what's missing? It's the consumer educators, it's extension. So, with the participants that I worked with in my study, consumer educators weren't even on the radar. They weren't helpful, they weren't unhelpful, they weren't even a thought. So, my suggestion for consumer educators is need to be more visible with these victims. And a way to do that is to partner with the helpful resources that the victims are already using, such as social workers, youth program staff, mental health professionals. Maybe you can provide educational workshops for clients, or maybe co-present educational workshops for their clients. Maybe you can develop and provide educational handouts that can be left in those professionals' offices for clients to pick up as they're leaving, or for the social worker or the mental health professional to provide to clients. With regard to reaching victims, again, younger familial identity theft victims are more likely to experience feeling worried or anxious, angry, and vulnerable. And to reach those younger familial identity theft victims, I think you would want to consider partnering with college and university counseling services and financial aid offices to provide educational materials. Now, I noticed in the chat that most of you are extension professionals, so you're likely already doing this, or maybe your state specialist is already doing this. And then higher income familial identity theft victims are more likely to experience physical consequences due to victimization. So to reach these victims, I encourage you to consider partnering with employee assistance programs, financial planners, and tax professionals to offer educational materials and programs. Because those higher income familial identity theft victims, they're likely already utilizing the services of financial planners and tax professionals. If they're struggling in some other capacity, they might be utilizing the services of an employee assistance program. When working with a client one-on-one, realize immediate family may not be a source of support. It likely isn't, whether that's emotionally, physically, or financially, or all of the above. So my suggestion is to have the client inventory their support resources and be ready to make referrals to community and other resources for gaps in support resources. So for instance, if there's a need for housing and maybe there's been a conflict in addition to the familial identity theft and the client can't go home because the offender lives with them, they need housing, There are housing resources within individual communities that you might be able to refer them to. You might be able to refer them for utilities assistance, or for emotional support. You might refer them to community counseling resources, food banks. There are all sorts of community resources out there that victims can be referred to for assistance. I think a shortcoming of a lot of the support that has been given to identity theft victims is that it just focuses on the financial, clearing that credit report, and then, oh, you're good to go. But there are a lot of emotional and physical and relational consequences that go along with familial identity theft victimization that, number one, aren't very well understood, and as a result of that are often ignored because we have a greater understanding of the financial consequences of identity theft victimization.